Well, thank you everybody for coming along this afternoon. I must admit, I feel a bit more relaxed than I did an hour ago. And I'm going to try and make this, fairly relaxed presentation. So let's not get too serious about things, although I've got to say that it is serious when you lose your life in an aeroplane crash. I'm going to tell you about my dad, who, as you know, lost his life in a flying accident at the Spartan School of Aeronautics on the 26th of June 1944. I'm going to talk about his life as a young man, when he grew up in the UK, and how he moved during the Great Depression south of England. I've taken an avid interest in this story, and more recently in the last months of his life, when he lost his life when he was only 26 years old. So we'll talk about his early days, his embarkation over to the USA, and then his ultimate tragic accident, and also how I actually found all of this information out in recent years, with the help of several people who are here today. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my dad's background. His father was a coal miner, and he lived in the northeast of England in a beautiful area known as Teesdale. He married a lady who was a farmer's daughter who lived on the other side of the mountain in an area called Weardale. And Weardale and Teesdale are two rivers. They married in the first decade of the 1900s, and they lived, I would say, a fairly simple rural lifestyle in a wonderful, beautiful, high exposed moorland hills and mountains. Now, when Ken was born, they already had a daughter, Mary, who was 7 years old, who I remember for many, many years. She only died about 10 years ago, but I got to know her very well, and I spent a lot of time with her. So she did tell me about my dad, as did my mum, of course. So they had when Ken was born on the 24th of August 1917, at that time of history, the war to end all wars, as President Woodrow Wilson said, was waging in Europe. And also, of course, in 1917, the American soldiers entered the theatre of war on the western front of France. Now, that's a long time ago. It's 100 years ago next year. And by the way, my dad would have been 100 next year. That makes me quite old as well. Now, the World War I conflict ceased in 1918, which was the year my dad was born. But not long after that, we were faced, as you were here, with economic and industrial chaos. And by 1930, and certainly up to 1940, on the eve of World War II, there were about 2 million people unemployed. And of course, at the same time here in the US, the Wall Street crash marked the beginning of your downward economic spiral. And then you had the Dust Bowl conditions in the agricultural heartland, such as here in Oklahoma, where the angry farmers were being driven from their homes, and economic hardship, bank closures, and the Great Depression took hold. And it reminds me of your wonderful, famous author, John Steinbeck, the grapes of wrath, when he said, "The grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy, growing ready for vintage." Meanwhile, during this chaotic period, back in the UK, Ken had completed his education at a school called King James Grammar School. He was a bright, clever pupil. He always achieved good academic results. And that's the first picture there when he was at his primary school, as we say. I don't know what you call it here, but he would be about I don't know, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old. And then there he is, I would say he's about 10 or 11. And growing up as a young lad in a fairly working class family, I would say. But he managed to move with his education into a more of an elitist group. And when I was doing the research into his school, I discovered that, funny enough, that I don't know whether you've heard of Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah.
Well, Stan Laurel, who was part of the Laurel and Hardy fame, was also a pupil at this school. By this time, Ken was, finding a job in his hometown was nigh impossible. And like lots of other people, you had to move into a new area of industrial opportunities or somewhere where things were happening and you could basically get a job. And by this time, his sister had already moved down to the south of England and to a town called Luton, which had a big car factory, which part of the US giant General Motors. And they created thousands and thousands of jobs. So Ken decided to follow his sister south. Then he got some temporary employment before getting a job again, and he decided a job in the police force would be good enough to get on with. So in September 1939, he was accepted as a policeman just after World War II had been declared. He enrolled at the Hendon Police College, and of course he was exempted from being drafted into the armed forces because he got what we called a reserved occupation as one of London's 20,000 policemen. Well, the Blitz quickly followed, and in 1940, raised by the German Luftwaffe, destroyed much of the city of London. And that's a typical picture of the city in those days. And the police duties changed rapidly from the normal day-to-day routine, and crime flourished under the cover of what we called the blackout. But during this period, Ken enjoyed periods of leave from the police duties, and he spent a lot of his time with his sister in the relatively safe environment of this town called Luton outside of London. He was an outgoing young man, and he excelled in his sports, and he enjoyed nights out with his pals, going along to the local dance halls and so on a Saturday night. The town of Luton was renowned for the manufacture of straw hats, and my maternal grandfather, Cyril Bartlett was his name, who I remember very well, he was the third generation of the family to run the family-owned hat manufacturing business. He was born in 1894, and he survived already the horrors of World War I after serving in the British Army in Belgium and France. He married after demobilised, and he had two daughters, Joyce and Edna. The eldest daughter, Joyce, and there she is my mom, who's a pretty vivacious girl. She also enjoyed nights out with her friends at the local dance hall on a Saturday night. And it was in a hotel called the George Hotel, which I remember very well, one Saturday night in 1941, that the handsome young Ken plucked up enough courage to ask the vivacious Joyce to dance, and there was an instant attraction. On the 26th of June 1942, a date which was later to have a huge significance on their lives for more the reasons than their wedding, Ken and Joyce were married, and they spent their honeymoon in the beautiful hills of Durham, close to Ken's hometown. But he then returned back south and carried on with his police duties until mid-1943, when he was called up by the War Office. Now, although the police force was a reserved occupation, as the war dragged on, the age of exemption rose until it was the turn of those policemen in the middle to late 20s to register for call-up, even though they had previously been exempt. Now, these men were mostly married, and they had settled domestic lives with wives who preferred their men to be breadwinners, alive, rather than dead heroes. And 26-year-old Ken Raisbeck and his new pregnant wife, heavily pregnant wife, Joyce, both fell into this category. But by definition, the police were physically fit men and accustomed to responsibility. Ken had a compulsory choice. He could either register into the Army or Navy or volunteer to join the RAF. Now, if he'd been registered in the Army or Navy, he would have found himself in short order either serving in some tank tour unit in North Africa, or maybe sailing the seas of the Atlantic on Atlantic convoys. So Ken pondered deeply about this, so my mom's told me, and he wondered if his grammar school education would qualify him for RAF aircrew. Now, all aircrew were volunteers, and they were selected for pilot training. But it was a lengthy process with a high failure rate, and it took well over a year. Even pre-operational flying ability was attained. But Ken also figured that he could be better equipped for a future career, maybe, with a pilot's license. When I've met some of these veterans, they moved on with their pilot's license after the war. They became commercial airline pilots. One was even a Concorde pilot, who I met at the RAF Club in London. Anyway, after several weeks and months, he was requested to report to the Aircrew Recruiting Centre in London, where he spent 4 weeks before being selected for elementary training programme in the UK. Now, only half of the applicants were offered this opportunity, although they were all academically qualified. But everybody wanted to be a pilot because it was a glamorous thing after the Battle of Britain. Pilots, wings, all the girls liked the pilots. But only a very few men achieved this goal. Anyway, Ken embarked upon his 50-week pre-wings training programme, which started in various RAF camps across the UK, where the cadets were posted for elementary flying training before they were confirmed as suitable candidates for commission pilot training overseas. Now, flying training to wing standard was carried out either in the USA, in Canada or South Africa, away from the dangers of the unpredictable English weather and of course the intruding German fighters. But only 20% of the original intake was offered this opportunity. The rest were remustered as navigators or bomb aimers. So the creme de la creme were finished up here in Miami. At the time, Ken was stationed in Manchester in January 1944 when he heard that he qualified for commission pilot training somewhere in the world, and he was then told he would be making a long trip across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind, of course, his lovely family and country, which was in the midst of war and testing the very soul of the nation. So he said goodbye to his heavily pregnant wife, my mom, and at their home in Luton, just after Christmas in January 1944, and only a few weeks before I was born, on the 19th of February 1944. She said to me many times, and she still says it now, that when he left for the USA on that cold January morning, he walked through the door of the house and out of her life as he headed for Liverpool to join his ship that would take him really on a one-way trip across the Atlantic Ocean to the USA. By By the 9th of February, 10 days before I was born, Ken had arrived here in Miami, and he wrote his first letter home. He spoke about the rough crossing, being sick for 9 hours and ill for 3 days. But when they finally sailed into the still, calm waters, he watched the skyline of New York grow closer, a sight, I suppose, that he was already familiar with from dozens of films. I suppose it looked exactly the same, the towering skyscrapers, Statue of Liberty, but what came as a shock to him were the lights. The entire city was ablaze with lights, and after years of total blackout in the UK, the sight, I suppose, was like fairyland. But he didn't stay there very long. He was soon marched off the ship onto a waiting train to Canada, of all places, going north. The train rumbled north across New England, and there's a photograph with the snow lying thickly on the ground. The train journeyed through the night, crossed into Canada, and finally arrived at Moncton in New Brunswick, where the guys were told which school they would be going to. He was told he was going to Miami, and everybody, as you know the story, thought that was in Florida. But he soon got used to the idea that he wasn't going to Florida. What you've got there is you can see the train, a typical picture of the train, and of course you've probably seen one of the ships, and that was the Queen Mary, which carried 6,000 men over the Atlantic, which was a dangerous thing to do, by the way, in itself, to cross the Atlantic in the early 40s. Anyway, from Chicago, the train headed south across the prairies to the Midwest, passing through Kansas City. I understand that he joined the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad, which at the time was, and I've actually Googled this song, it was sung by Judy Garland, written by Johnny Mercer, and a few days ago I could remember how to sing it, but I'm not going to try to do it. But a few hours later, the train came to a stop in its ultimate destination in Miami, and in the last few days, I wanted to see everything. I wanted to see where that train stopped, and Nancy's driven me all over town, pointing out different places, and I've seen where he got off that train. And I thought it would be like a station with a platform, but he must have climbed down the steps, and there he was in Miami. But he recorded in his voluminous letters that his first brief impressions of as the bus swept through the Miami streets on its way to the railway station, from the railway station to the airfield, 3 miles out of town, he reported a favourable look at the town. He said that the main street was lined up with parked cars and trucks. He said it looked bright, clean sort of place. And then he wrote about the flying school, which he said was cleaner, brighter and more comfortable than anything he'd been used to back home. He said that the centrepiece of the building complex, which you should be seeing in a minute, which is the view of the airfield, but no doubt a lot of you are familiar with that. There you see the barracks in the front, just there, and these are so they're the barracks, that's the reception, and then there's the old hangar up the road there where all of the classrooms were. Now, this building complex was an ex-tourist hotel known as the Pierce Pennant, and I guess a lot of you guys know far more about that than I do. I understand that in the late 1920s and 30s, the hotel was a popular stop-off for people travelling along Route 66, but it closed in 1940. But once again, it was serving a useful purpose, and the rest of the complex comprised long, low wooden buildings, all recently erected by the look of them, set around the square, as my dad wrote, set around the square with well-kept grass and crossed by immaculate paths, as he wrote. And in the middle of the square was a flagpole from which Old Glory and the RAF flag were flying. Now it's an ice cream parlour. He said that the mess was another revelation. It was sort of cafeteria style, with a large choice of appetising food, limitless in quantity. He'd never been used to that. Served by cheerful, smiling American civilians. The quarters, he said, sparkled with cleanliness, unlike back home. And the janitor did all of the cleaning. There were stout wooden bunks, he said, and every man had his own locker-cum wardrobe in which to stow his kit. The airfield was 300 yards up the road by the school buildings, and as you know, the old hangar is there to this day. I noticed yesterday when I was flying over the runways, I could still see parts of the old runways, and that was quite interesting. Well, Ken hadn't been here very long when he wrote about the welcoming address he had from his CEO, Wing Commander Roxburgh. They told them in no certain manner that they were guests in a foreign country and that the RAF would be judged by the way in which they conducted themselves. But the CEO also told them that after his pep talk, they would shortly have their first taste of local hospitality to a dance at the high school, which had been arranged to welcome these boys. The social life in Miami was well recorded in Ken's letters. And, you know, we had this wonderful visit to the Coleman Theatre yesterday. He wrote a lot about the Coleman Theatre because he was a regular visitor there. He wrote that he wasn't allowed to smoke in there. That was his main gripe, though. Because he said they also said they've got things called air conditioning. We've never heard of that thing. And you know, the movies were free to cadets. And I picked up a little notice in one of the booklets where it says that, you know, boys, the RAF cadets would be welcome to the Coleman Theatre. All these boys played a lot of sports, of course, including athletics, soccer, swimming, golf, and all of them were in first-class physical condition. They had to be. But the Miami folk were kind and helpful to cadets. They had phenomenal success in hitchhiking. I remember everybody said that they would be, if anybody was seen walking in the street, somebody would stop and pick them up. We don't do that anymore. No. Sadly, certainly in our country. Ken wrote about his leave vacations to Kansas and Chicago. And over the coming months he wrote many more letters to his wife, my mum, his parents, his sister and friends. You know, don't forget this is in the days before, you know, the joys of Skype, and he didn't even have access to a telephone, so everything was written on what were called aerograms, and they were tiny little pieces of paper which didn't weigh very much, I suppose, and that was all part of the war effort in keeping the weight of paperwork down. But he wrote so many letters. I've got them all, a lot of them in this briefcase. I had to copy them, put them in a file and give them to the library here. There's my mum again, and she's written on that letter, photograph, to my darling husband, only forever. Now, everybody in those days had what they called their song, and their song was called Only Forever, and I don't know how it goes, but I'll check it out one of these days. Now, this is the first intake of Ken's flight. There were 100 men, there was 50 men in that picture, but there were 100 in A course. He was part of course 20, There are 2 flights there. Now, out of those 100 boys who arrived to start their training, the wastage from the original recruiting applications was considerable, and it reduced from 500 to 100. So 500 men applied to do that job, and when they applied to do the job, they all had the requisite academic qualifications. They were all fit, but the standards were so high that there was such a big wastage. And even the guys that arrived here, these 50 boys, well, 50 there and 50 in another group, and they're all up on those photographs down there, they lost another 20 boys per 50. So, you know, at the end of the day, you had to be pretty damn good to get through this course. And the standards of the the American schools were notably high. So he started his training program, and that began immediately, and it intensified as time went on, and he moved from primary to advanced training. And he wrote with excitement, that's a picture taken on the runway next to the old hangar, which I stood in a puddle there yesterday, and I said, I'm standing, there he is, and I'm standing right where he was when that picture was taken. So he wrote, there he is, and that's one of my favourite pictures because he's right in the middle of the group. He's a leader of men, definitely. And he wrote home about the excitement of and the challenges of solo aerobatics, spinning his plane, formation flying, night flying, which required a high standard of skill. He wrote home about his instructor, whose name was Lentz, and there he is in the middle there. He said to his folks, this guy's only 22 years old. He's 4 years younger than me. He only left school 3 years ago. But half of each day was spent flying and the other half was spent on the ground school. And 4 cadets were assigned to each of the flying instructors. They were all American citizens, civilians rather, all had aviation backgrounds, but again goes back to the high failure rate, and where a further 20% washed out, and that means they were sent back to Moncton to remuster as navigators or bomb aimers. Ken graduated from primary training in the Fairchild, which you can see there, to advanced training flying the Harvard 86, or as the Americans call it, the Texan. Ken wrote home, he said the Harvard had one unmistakable characteristic, and that was the ear-splitting noise as it flew overhead. He said in his letter, it must have been one of the noisiest machines ever produced. And I can tell you yesterday I found that out. I don't know whether you know, but I actually flew out of Miami in an 86 Harvard yesterday afternoon. But due to modern technology, you've got a little button to press, you wear earphones and you can suppress the noise. So I never really got the full feeling of what it was like in those days. He said that, you know, the plane cruised at 160 miles an hour at a top speed of 180 and something approaching 250 miles an hour in a dive. And Ken was soon flying solo in these planes after only 8 hours dual. And those who graduated the advanced training, into advanced training, were fully expected to get their wings, and they were pushed even harder, both in their flying and ground studies. Well, as the months rolled by, January, February, March, April, May, and then June, Ken was then promoted by his CO to take charge as squadron leader of his flight. On Friday the 23rd of June 1944, Ken wrote to his mum and dad, and it was his last letter, and here's an extract. There it is there. Dear Mum and Dad, well, here I am again, now promoted to flight leader, can you believe it? I'm so proud of this achievement. I've just another 5 weeks tomorrow before I get my wings, and when I'll be glad when that day comes. I think I've earned them now after all the work that I've done over the past year or so. I'm still flying day and night, but only a few more hours to do. I would be glad to get back to England once more, especially with wings, and feel very confident about passing out. How's everything at home? It looks like the war will be over this year sometime, especially after the invasion success 3 weeks ago. And that is, of course, the D-Day landings. I'm still living in the lap of luxury food-wise. I'm going to miss it all when I leave. Well, cheerio for now, and remember me to your loving son, Ken. Ken spent the weekend relaxing by the pool, and again I went to that swimming pool this week to see what it looked like. He relaxed by the pool with his pals, and he's sitting on the diving board in the middle of those people. This photo was taken on a Sunday morning and given to me 50 years later by his pal John Weeks, who's sitting on his left-hand side there. John, I don't know whether John's still alive, but he invited me to his home, and on the next shot I think you'll see me standing in John's garden. Wow. John told me about the morning that Ken came into the mess, or the cafeteria as you call it, with a picture of his wife and his new son. Aren't I beautiful? And that picture was pinned on his locker. And it's a very special picture because it was with him for his rest of his stay in Miami. This is the original photograph. You can still see the pin marks in the photograph where it was pinned onto the locker door. And it was a great source of pleasure and anticipation as his friend Stan Berry was later to write in his letter of condolence. Well, on Monday the 26th of June 1944 at around 9 o'clock, Ken climbed into the cockpit of his Harvard, started the engine and taxied along the runway ready for takeoff in preparation for a morning session of aerobatics. The plane roared into the sky, taking off into a northwesterly direction towards Chatopa. But little did he know that he was approaching the last minutes of his life. He was instantly killed when the plane nosedived with its engine roaring at full blast into a soya field in Richland Township, northwest of Chatopa and southeast of Oswego, Kansas. That is a picture of a pilot's route map, and you can clearly see the area that they were flying in during those days, and Chatopa, Oswego, Baxter, and Edna, Bartlett, by the way, that's another little thing. There are two places right next to Chatopa. One is called Edna and the other one is called Bartlett. My mother's maiden name was Bartlett, and her sister's name was Edna. Now how about that for a coincidence? Anyway, he was, as I just said, the plane dived into the field, the soya field, and I'll show you some of that later on, southwest of Oswego. And according to news clippings of the day, a number of people witnessed the plane fall, including several farmers. One reported that the plane was already in distress before it hit the ground. We've never found a crash report or any evidence at all as to why the plane fell from the sky. But the general consensus was that it did not pull out of an aerobatic loop, and he may have suffered the effects of G-forces. But as I said at the other time, it's purely conjecture. He may have been practicing dive bombing and didn't pull out of a nose dive, but we will never know. It may have been a mechanical failure, it could have been all sorts of things. Now, when I was on holiday with my lovely friend Joan over there, staying with her son in Dubai last Christmas, I had a few moments with nothing to do, and I suddenly thought to myself, you know, I went out to Miami quite a few years ago now, and I just accept the fact that my dad's laying in his grave. I spoke to lots of pilots here and tried to establish exactly what happened or where the crash happened. Nobody could tell me anything. No crash reports, nothing. So I decided by chance with these modern age of digital technology and telephones, mobile phones and whatever, to Google the Joplin newspaper, and I googled the Joplin Globe. I found the name Joplin Globe, and I found an article on Thursday the 29th of June, and there it is there, so you've moved one ahead, and it said that Ken Raisbeck, former London policeman, was instantly killed in a plane crash 4 miles south of Oswego at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. Raisbeck was a British cadet at the RAF training school in Miami. The crash was one of the worst that's happened in this immediate community. Those who saw the tragedy think that the plane headed nose downwards with its motor roaring at full blast from an altitude of about 2,500 feet. This article, by the way, is the next article, which is that one. Now, when I found that first cutting, I got in touch with Nancy, who then, I said, can you find any more, are there any more cuttings? And this is when Phil came into the picture. My newfound friend Philip Blair, who lives in Oswego, and he's in charge of the Oswego Historical Society. So Philip actually came up with this article. And later, Philip told me that not only did he find it in his records, but it was published by his father, his grandfather, who owned the Oswego Independent newspaper, who visited the crash site, came back and wrote this article. It's fairly graphic. It goes on to explain that the motor buried itself into the ground, taking a greater part of the pilot with it. It crashed on the farm owned by Mrs. Elsie Hanson, which is something we knew, and the officials soon came out and roped off the farm and started work of removing the body of the cadet and the plane. Now, it also mentions a few people who saw the plane come down. One of them was a guy called Cleo Mosler, who occupied the farm, and again a guy called James Tullis, the farmer in the community. And so he said he saw the plane, as I said earlier, it was already in distress before it hit the ground. Another man called Claude, another farmer working the field, was on the C.B. farm across the Labette Creek, also saw the plane crash. Mr. and Mrs. Woodrow Bryant, who lived just up the road, were picking blackberries when they saw the plane fall. Ling Dudgeon of Oswego, who was doing some pipe laying for the American Gas Company, heard the crash and hurried to the scene and was first to reach the spot. So all of this information suddenly came out of the woodwork, in the last few months of this year. And I knew nothing about this sort of thing until Nancy and Phil dug it all out of the records. But by the Monday night, the body had been taken back to Miami along with the plane parts, and the funeral services were held there on the Wednesday at G.A.R. Cemetery in Miami. But while things were being recovered at the crash site, and while the work of recovering the plane and the body were going on, another RAF plane flew overhead, as according to article that was Phil found, and did some aerobatic stunts over the top of the crash site in some, which was presumed to be some sort of airman's salute from one flyer to a fallen comrade. So, on the 26th of June, the fatal day, which was 2 years to the day after my mum and dad got married, my mother received a telegram. It was no doubt received after the 26th of June, but it was posted the 26th of June. It said quite simply, regret to inform you that your husband Kenneth Raisbeck has lost his life as a result of an aircraft accident on the 26th of June 1944. She still talks about that moment in her life when she opened it and said, I thought it was a wedding anniversary message. Oh. And she still says she could not contemplate lost his life. What is this business about the loss of life? You know, when guys were sent over to America to learn to fly, everybody knew that flying was dangerous, but it was not in combat, and it wasn't as safe as sitting at home doing your knitting, but nevertheless you didn't expect to be caught up in this sort of thing. The boys that came back from here, they certainly were, and especially in the early years of those photographs up there, in the top 50%, they got in all sorts of trouble in the bombing of Europe and being shot down by and you know, fatalities in combat. But when somebody came out here, how exciting to say I've been selected to be a pilot or go for pilot training, go to America where hardly anybody had ever been in life, get on a ship and have a fantastic opportunity in your life and come back with your wings. Then that's when the job started, of course. But it didn't happen like that for Kenneth Raisbeck, and services were held in the Lane Funeral Home, which is still there, and I went to see that as well this week. I'm not missing out on anything. The rites were held at the grave shortly afterwards, and officiated by Harry Curtis, who was the minister of the First Presbyterian Church here in Miami. And he was also the chaplain of the flying school. Now, officers of the trainer school and a large group of cadets from Ken's flight were in attendance. The pallbearers were mostly ex-police officers who, incidentally, always held the most senior positions on these courses, except for some more bright people like my friend Flight Lieutenant Ken Odell. I've got to say that because I know he'll be watching this sooner or later. My family received many kind letters from very, very many people, including Minister Harry Curtis, Wing Commander Roxburgh, and several cadets on the same flight as Ken. There's Harry Curtis with one of Dad's friends, Jerry Potter. I don't know who the ladies are. I guess it's the Reverend Curtis's wife. He, by the way, officiated at nearly every one of the crash ceremonies. Kent Stanberry, who is not to be seen as yet, wrote a very moving letter of condolence in which he commented that he couldn't fail to notice the daily letters that my mum wrote to Ken. He also noted that the photograph of the baby, which is me, was pinned up in the locker, and he said it was a great source of pleasure and anticipation to Ken. And Stan knew Ken for almost a year. They had both been policemen. They went through the elementary course together before coming out to the States. They went everywhere together and shared the same experiences, like first solo trip, examinations, leave together in Kansas City. And, he said that Ken had an unassuming manner about him, but he was very confident. He also said he had no idea how he met his untimely death, and he only presumed that he had blacked out or was temporarily stunned during aerobatics. He also said, Stan said, that he was in the air at the same time, and he watched Ken doing his manoeuvres, and everything was going okay, and he was totally shocked when he heard the tragic news. He said that he thought maybe that Ken knew nothing about it, otherwise he said he would have bailed out, and he said he was far too steady a guy. I showed these few letters, and one of them was written by the ladies of the Servicemen Centre. And I want to read out a few names here, just in case anybody remembers these names who lived in Miami. Well, the first one was Mrs. Taylor Stein, Mrs. George Stein, Mrs. Jenny Williams, Mrs. Anne Cochrane, Miss Lucille Furnish, Miss Dorothy Primsell, Miss Webb, Miss Margaret Hawley, Miss Marilyn Worley, Betty Chesaweth, Miss Udith Middleton, Miss Kay Breedlove, Minnie Jennison, Miss Hatfield, Jean Warren, Kathleen McBrien, Melba Urco, Beth Tibbety, Leah Kite and Peggy Boyd. Did anybody know those names?
I knew a few of them.
Do you really?
And I'm a historian in the Presbyterian Church, and a lot of those names are in the
Yeah, well I thought maybe they would be.
Thank you.
Well, as I said earlier, you know, the loss of my father was a great shock to my family when they thought that he was in a fairly safe environment. But eventually life moved on, like it did for many thousands of others who were bereaved in the war. But it was hard for a war widow, a 24-year-old war widow with a 6-month-old baby. And the whole of the lifestyle had to change to suit the situation. Like my grandparents brought me up for a few years and my mum went out to work. But 6 years later she married again. I had a new father in my life. In fact, he was the first father I ever knew. He called me son and I called him dad. And I loved him. And he actually died in my arms not very many years ago. But although my dad, Ken, my biological father, was never forgotten, and he was frequently mentioned, I just accepted that he lay in his grave in Miami, Oklahoma, thousands of miles away. But I didn't know enough about him, and I needed to know more about him from other men. So, on the 50th anniversary of his crash, I put a notice in our national newspaper, which is called the Daily Telegraph, in the military column, and I just said, in memory of my father, Kenneth Raisbeck, who lost his life in a flying accident at the Spartan School of Aeronautics in Miami, Oklahoma, and I just put underneath John Mersum, Kent, which is my village. And to my astonishment, I received many calls from people who remembered him. And I then joined the number 3 British Flying Training School Association, and I became privileged and I got to know these men and I learned more of my dad, and I accompanied them to the 50th anniversary of VE Day, and that is the last time I was here. Now, I'm wearing a hat there. No, I'm not. I'm not wearing it, but I've still got it. But I had strict instructions today to wear the hat and the tie, because Ken said to me, you may be the last B.F.T.S member, although I'm a generation younger than those guys, I'm still a member, to be here, because they're all passing on. But Ken, who stands there is Ken O'Dell. He is the same age there as I am now. My son, Oliver, is 20 years old, and he is the same age that lots of these boys were when they were killed in these crashes. But Ken has willingly provided me with many ideas and contacts in the pursuit of my project, And he, you know, as I said, he encouraged me to join the association. I came with him on the anniversary of B.E. Day. There we are standing in front of the headstone. And at the same time, by the way, I was contacted by Scott Thompson of KOTV Tulsa, who was a television news journalist, and he made a program called Silver Wings in Prairie Skies, and I am featured in one of those episodes, which I was very proud of, and it's tucked away in my memory box somewhere. Now, I just want to pause here a little bit while I just say a thing or two about Ken. I've already said that it was his, well, I haven't said that yesterday was his 93rd birthday. So I sent him a picture of Joan and myself standing on the steps of the Dobson Theatre, not the Coleman Theatre. And there he is. So he would have received yesterday the photograph to, you know, remind him of the fact that I'm doing my job out here and paying orders. Now, I just want to mention Tony Banks, because, Tony Marsh, because Tony, he was the main organiser of so many of these visits here. And he unfortunately passed away last year. But Ken asked me to deliver this, which is Tony's badge that he wore on visits to Miami, and we would like to give it to the library, because Tony had collated the most wonderful book of his time spent here, which included his voyage from UK, his trip back, because he was a survivor and he went into the theatre of war, of course. But that is that little badge, and I've done what I've been asked to do. Now, Tony Marsh, and there he is. And I know that Ken and Tony would have been pleased about this. And I was asked, by the way, to mention a name of a friend he had here in Miami, and the name is Edie Ingram. I don't know whether anybody knows Edie. You do?
Same lady.
And somebody, yes?
I'm Edie.
Oh.
Sorry, I was talking to you at the cemetery, yeah.
Yes.
Well, there you are, you see. Edie Ingram. And Edie told me earlier that she spent a holiday with her lovely husband at Ken's home. And also a lady called Polly Dovin, who lives in Grove. I don't know if anybody knows that name. But
I do know Polly. I converse back and forth with her quite often, as a matter of fact.
just to carry on, well, we're coming to the last bit of my story now, and quite a lot has happened in the 4 days since I arrived here last Monday. We went over to Oswego to meet up with Phil last Tuesday rather, and we went to what we understand to be the crash site. Now that is a picture taken on Google Earth, and I've pored over this picture day after day, and I'm pretty familiar with that site. You can zoom into that. That is the Elsie Hansen plot, the railway line going through it. There's a house there, there's an elm tree there, there's various hedgerows, and the soya beans are growing right in that spot just there. We think the plane came down roughly where that red spot is. So I've been, I was really excited about going over to meet Philip. Philip and I have been on the phone many, many times over the last few months, talking about different things. And Philip took me and Joan and I along the gravel road that everybody else went along on the day of the crash, out of Oswego, down the road with Dr. Fordyce, the sheriff, and any other interested officials. to do what they had to do. We stood in the Sawyer field. That's Joan and I at the History Museum with a wonderful welcome that we got. That was on Tuesday. We then went along to the Sawyer field to where we thought the crash site was, which was corroborated by a lady who Philip tracked down and who lived in a house very close to the crash site. And she was only 5 years old when the plane came down, but she remembered the noise it made. And she said it was like a bomb dropping. But when you think, everybody think, how much can you remember about your life when you're only 5 years old? Not very much. But if you hear an explosion like that, I think it made a big impact. But not only did I speak to Dolores Steinbrook, I also spoke to her mom, who was 100 years old. I spoke to her on the telephone on Tuesday, and I asked her what she thought about, what she knew about this crash site. And she confirmed that it crashed on the other side of the railway line, about as he called it, one block, the other side of the railway line, and roughly in line with the Bryant's farm. So there we are. That's the elm tree, which Phil and I, we always say that the elm tree can tell the story. And Phil did a call through the trunk to try and establish how old it was, to make sure it can tell the story. And it is more than 70 years old. Yeah, right. So I've covered that, and let's just ad-lib through this now then. I want to just have a quick look at the next photograph or two. There I am standing in the middle of the field. That is me with Dolores on Thursday afternoon, never met her before. She'll say she was 5 years old when the plane came down. There we are on Wednesday, Joan and I and Nancy went to the Dobson Museum after having been to the library here in town. I'll say a few things about the library. That the library is such a wonderfully documented area of interest for the B.F.T.S people. Everything is beautifully documented. You can find so much information there. And I found the daily logbook, which covers every single day that this training facility has been running for. I looked up the 26th of June, and the entry, of course, says AC2 Kenneth Raisbeck killed, plane crash. And then the day after that, it mentions who was appointed, Flight Lieutenant so-and-so, Flight Lieutenant so-and-so, are appointed to conduct a court of inquiry as to what happened. I haven't seen nothing about crash reports or courts of inquiry. That is a big missing link in the story. But when we went to the Dobson Museum in the afternoon, which I've been to before, Mercy, I've been to the Dobson Museum before, and rummaged around in there, and I found, 20 years ago, I found a letter from my grandmother to Mrs. Hill, thanking her for the wonderful work she'd done on her son's grave. So there are things there that I've seen before, but to my astonishment, when they brought out an old trunk, a dusty old trunk, which was full of undocumented pictures, different bits and pieces. At the bottom of that trunk I found a ragged little photograph album, very thin, and as I started to open it, dog-eared pages, and every page had a course number on it, course 1 to 22. And I thought, well, I can't spend all day looking at this, let me just turn over to course 20. Lo and behold, on course 20 is a picture of a plane crash.
Wow.
And there it is. So, I don't know whether you guys can see things, but I'm pretty sure that that is my dad's plane. It's definitely an 86 Harvard. This is all news. It's all and I was speaking to Perry over here this morning up at the airfield, and I asked him what he thought about it, and he said to me, that is, well, without question, it's fatality. You can see the, come on Joe, you tell me what these pieces are. That's the rudder, is it?
Yeah, that's the rudder.
That's the rudder, and the, what are these bits?
That's the elevator.
Elevator, which according to Perry are made of fabric,
Yeah, that's metal and covered with fabric.
covered with fabric.
Wow.
You can see the engine, and the propeller there. Now that is not the plane as it hit the ground, because the engine would be the other end of the plane. I think that is where they moved the parts out of the field by Bryant's farm, ready for collection back to the air base here in Miami. But you know, that's a whole bundle of mess, and without question about it, that is definitely a fatality. And you can see the canopy, you can see the cowling, the engine cowling, bits of the wheel, and the front of the plane is a total write-off. These bits have survived. There's a piece of wing somewhere else. Can you go to the next one, Nancy? Am I in anybody's way? And well, the next thing I did, because I could see a white blob in the background, which is that. And I thought, I know the house where Dolores lived is no longer standing there, but I met somebody yesterday who said it wasn't knocked down very long ago. I'm standing by Bryant's farm where I think those crash pieces were. I'm looking towards that house. I can see a couple of trees there, and they're still there now. They're the two trees. What are they elder?
Cedar.
Cedars. And I reckon there's a railway line running along there, because there wouldn't be telegraph pylons, and I understand, unless it's a railway line. So we go back to the other picture, Nancy. So there we go again, and there's the telegraph pole, and that right there is the white blob. And if you stand on the roadway here, outside Bryant's farm, you can line up everything, the railway line, everything, and I am almost certain that that is Kenneth Raisbeck's crash site, or not the crash site, the remains of the aeroplane. Now, it would probably come out of somewhere around here, which is where the soya beans were growing. So that is really an achievement, a very sad achievement, may I say, but it's got to be, you know, it's got to be part of my collection, and it is part of the story. So I just have to accept that that is how my dad ended his life. Now, there we are with all the boys who lost their lives. We know that 4 of them were lost in one day when they crashed into each other. We know that 1 walked into a propeller. So there are 5 boys at least we can eliminate from establishing for sure as to whether that picture of the crash is my father's. But I will persevere until I know for sure that it is. But unfortunately, even the number on the fuselage doesn't seem to help us at all. Now, oh, here we go again. That is my mom.
Oh.
She is still alive. She spends a lot of time with me. She's never been here. It was a huge emotional shock for the whole of her life. Even now, she can't handle it. She doesn't know anything about the detail I've gone into since I've been here, or what I was going to do when I came here. I said, Mum, do you want me to come and tell you the full story? She said, I don't really know. I said, because there's a lot of graphic detail here. And I sometimes think, you know, it's maybe best to let things as they are. That is my family, my stepdad, who called me son and I called him dad. There's my half-brother and all of the family that I spent as my life evolved. Next one, that is my son. who is now 41. He only looks like a young lad. He is Ken's grandson, and that is his son, who is Ken's great-grandson. That was taken last Christmas. We were playing, Joan and I were playing golf about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and a friend of mine phoned me to say a Harvard had landed on his runway. He's a farmer. Come and have a look. And I gave up 9 holes of golf to go and sit in his cockpit, and there I am in the cockpit. Unfortunately, we haven't got anything, because yesterday's event was so hot off the press. I'm just going to repeat what I just touched on a few minutes ago, and that is that Nancy and her guys and Kim arranged for me to get in a Harvard 86 at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon and fly up to Oswego. We did a couple of circuits around the Sawyer field where the plane came down. Beneath it we could see all of our friends waving from Oswego, waving flags.
Oh, wow.
And we came back here, landed back at Miami base. I was interviewed by the channel, whatever it is, 9 at KOAM, and it was on the television twice last night on different stations. Anyway, I'm just going to finish off now, but that is, by the way, there's the instrument panel, and if you look, as Perry pointed out to me a few hours ago, if you look on the crash site photographs, that panel is dislodged and it's hanging outside the plane.
Wow.
But that would be my father's last view as he headed towards the ground. And you know, when I was speaking to one of my friends who flies the Yellow Harvard, I said to him, what do you think? He's bailed out a couple of times out of planes. He said, if you're heading towards the ground, I said, what are you thinking about? He said, I can tell you, you're not thinking about your wife and family. You're thinking about how the hell am I going to get out of this situation? And he said, you haven't got long to make a decision, because if you're travelling at 250 miles an hour at 2,500 feet, you've only got 10 seconds before you hit the ground. And if you haven't made a decision in 5 of them, it's too late. So, can we go back?
Yes.
So that's where he was sitting, and that's what he could see on Elsie Hanson's farm. I think he was a bit lower than that, but something like that as he was going down. The next photograph is the memorial page that was put in the what's it called, the post? Open post. Every course had an open post. I noticed they put it on page 13. And it's a memorial to Kenneth Raisbeck. So I think that's the end of the story, except to say thank you for coming along, everybody. Thank you for Nancy, Philip, particularly Philip in Oswego, who's got the bit between his teeth. His wife's fed up with him. So is my lovely partner Joan, who's told the national television that I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to work on this project, which is true, but not every day.
No, not every day.
But I think we're going to have a bit of a break. But quite honestly, I'm going off to Florida tomorrow to play golf, and I need to do that, because it's been such a roller coaster ride, and in the last 3 or 4 days has just topped the whole thing. Thank you to my lovely friend Joan, because you know, on a trip like this you need somebody to hold your hand and push you through, and she's done it beautifully. That's it.